Hey kids, welcome to today's lecture on Russia during the Age of Imperialism. Um, uh, this week's class is going to be asynchronous because I'm planning on being in a canoe in a swamp in the second half of this week. So I figured I would just record the lecture for you all. There are guided notes, and I would like for you guys to complete those guided notes and submit them into your WAP work folder. Uh, that way you can be counted present for today's class. So please do that, and that will show me that you did the thing. I'm at the beach right now. That's my friend Andrew. We're best buds. He's reading a book. That's one reason we're best buds. All right, so anyway, now to Russia. So this is a picture of the coronation of the last Russian Tsar, Tsar Nicholas II. This coronation took place around the year 1900, but you'll notice that it looks like it could have taken place maybe in 1700 or in the Middle Ages. There's the Russian nobility and the heads of the Russian church decked out in gold cloth. So the main point of this image is that Russia, even in the 20th century, was old school, like super old school. And the problem here is that Russia is going to try and compete with Western Europe. Western Europe is modernizing very rapidly, industrializing, and Russia is trying to keep up. And what Russia is going to try and do is they're going to try and keep this old school form of government with like a divine right monarchy and an absolute ruler and stuff like that, while also trying to modernize their economy and their society. And this is a complicated task that's not really going to work out very well for them. And it's ultimately going to end with revolution and a communist takeover in 1917, which we'll get to later. But yeah, so what we're going to be looking at today is Russia's attempt to modernize its society in order to compete effectively with Western Europe. So our guiding questions are: how does Russia compare with Western Europe in 1800? What efforts does Russia make to catch up to Western Europe in the 19th century? And how successful are these efforts at reform? So let's start by looking at where Russia is in 1800. In the year 1800, Russia is still a feudal, absolutist society. It's more or less the same as France or Austria or other European societies in the 1600s and 1700s. And so what this means is that they have an absolute monarch who has no legal boundaries on what he can do, a little bit like Louis XIV in France. And the ruling class is made up of feudal aristocrats. So the old nobility who can trace their land ownership and status back for generations. Russia is a wildly unequal society. The top 5% of society are wealthy aristocrats, feudal nobility, who own pretty much all the land. There's a very small middle class living in cities, about 5% of the population. That means that basically 95% of Russia's population still lives in rural areas. Whereas in Western Europe, you're seeing by 1800 already a lot of urbanization and the beginnings of industrialization. And 90% of Russia's population are poor agricultural workers, most of whom are serfs. Serfdom is, or being a serf is a legal category. If you are a serf, you are legally bound to live on somebody else's land and to work for that person. It is pretty much indistinguishable from slavery, except that you do have some legal rights and some restrictions on when you can be bought and sold. So unlike slavery in the Americas, you're not legally a piece of property, but you're pretty close. And you're basically owned by whoever's land you live on. And so this is a society in which the top 5% of the society owns the bottom 90% of the society. And serfdom is going to be a huge problem for Russia because the serfs are not allowed to leave their land, which means that they are stuck in the rural countryside. which makes it basically impossible for Russia to industrialize, because before you can industrialize, you have to have people who can move to the cities to work in the factories and take all of the new jobs. Right. And last of all, as I already mentioned, Russia was an absolute monarchy. The Tsar, which means the emperor, or literally the Caesar of Russia, believed that he got his power from God, and that he could literally pass any law he wanted. Also, Russia's very big. They started out over here, right next to Europe. This part is actually considered to be part of Europe by most people. Exactly where Europe ends is unclear, because Europe is really just part of Asia. So Russia started out over here, centered on the capital city of Moscow, and then expanded eastward, taking over the entire northern part of Asia, mostly for the sake of the fur trade. Excuse me. But so anyway, that's Russia in 1800. It is very, very different from Western Europe, which is already urbanizing, which has a large urban population, and in which even the poorest farmers can move around freely and look for new jobs. So Russia's several steps behind in terms of modernizing and industrializing. Just to give you a sense of how far behind Russia is, here are two pictures from the year 1900. On the left are Russian peasants. These peasants are holding their traditional tools, which you'll notice, I mean, it might be kind of hard to see, the picture might be a little blurry, but these traditional tools are made of wood. The Russian peasants are still using wooden tools to farm in the year 1900. On the right, you see a picture of the Carnegie Steel Plant in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. This is one of the largest steel plants in the world, and it is cutting-edge industrial technology that's churning out thousands and thousands of tons of steel every year. This is the United States, and this is at the same time. So while Russia is still having poor peasants farm by hand, the United States has turned into the world's largest industrial power and is churning out electricity and oil and steel at incredible rates. So these are two societies that have developed at greatly different speeds. Now, Russia is going to try and attempt to catch up to the United States and to Western European industrial powers, but they're not going to be very successful, at least not until Stalin takes over, which we'll talk about later. So let's talk about why Russia was so far behind Western Europe in terms of social and economic development. One of the big early causes was the conquest of the Russian territory by the Mongols in the 1300s. Unlike the rest of Europe, Russia actually was conquered and ruled by the Mongols for several hundred years. The Mongol Empire spread out very quickly and then fragmented into different parts, as you might remember, and the part of the Mongol Empire that ruled over Russia was known as the Golden Horde. And the Golden Horde basically just let the Russians do their own thing and demanded tribute from them, and kind of just took wealth and produce from Russia and transferred it to Central Asia, where the Golden Horde preferred to hang out. The Mongol domination of Russia lasted for about 250 years, and this meant that Russia was cut off from the rest of Europe, whereas France and Germany and Italy and Spain and Britain were all going through the Renaissance and the voyages of exploration and were making important early scientific breakthroughs, developing the printing press. Russia wasn't taking part in any of this. Russia was instead facing east and interacting with the Mongols. So we see a picture here of a Mongol leader coming to a village near Moscow, and you can see the local population bowing down before this Mongol guy. So anyway, this helps to explain why Russia did not develop at the same rate as Western Europe. It's because they were cut off from the voyages of exploration and all of the economic and social developments that came out of that. The first person who tries to bring Russia into the modern age and tries to take advantage of all of the scientific breakthroughs that happened in Europe was Peter the Great. Peter the Great was a really weird guy. There's lots of funny stories about him, um, but I don't really want to go into those just for the sake of time. But if you want to know more about him, you should take AP Euro. Um, but he basically realized that Western Europe was developing very rapidly, and that if Russia was going to be a great power, that they needed to figure out to uh, how to mimic the scientific and economic development of Western Europe. And so he brought in a whole bunch of experts and a whole bunch of technology from Britain and France and the Netherlands. He brought in engineers, he brought in generals to train his troops, he brought in doctors and dentists, he bought up textbooks, he brought in printing presses and telescopes, and he basically tried to transform Russia into a giant version of Western Europe. But he was only partially successful. And while he did introduce a whole lot of new technologies and new military strategies to Russia, the Russian economy didn't really change very much. 90% of the population remained serfs, and very, very few people actually moved to cities under Peter the Great's reign. So while Peter the Great gets the process of westernization started, Russia still remains very different from the Western European countries that he's trying to copy. It's interesting, you can see here, is that Peter the Great has dressed himself up as a Western European. He's got the fancy collar and the fancy coat, and he's portraying himself with a cannon and a map. Two pieces of European technology that came out of this time period, with advanced European astronomy and mathematics being used to produce highly accurate maps, and advanced techniques in metallurgy and physics being used to develop more and more effective cannons. So anyway, that's Peter the Great. He tries to modernize Russia in the 16 and 1700s and only achieves mixed results. Another person who attempted to modernize Russia and also achieved only very mixed results was Catherine the Great. Catherine the Great ruled during the Enlightenment, and she was very interested in Enlightenment ideas, including human rights, limited government, and economic development. However, she was also only very partially successful. She attempted to write a new law code. She attempted to make Russian society much more like French or English society, but there were some very serious limits to what she could accomplish, primarily because she was unwilling to abolish serfdom. And because she was unwilling to abolish serfdom, it meant that any of her changes would only really apply to the small number of people living in cities, whereas the 90% of the Russian population that lived in the countryside would remain more or less where they were hundreds of years ago. That is, farming using very primitive methods, barely eking out an existence, and more or less dominated by the local lord who owned their land. So both Peter the Great and Catherine the Great attempt to modernize Russia, but they fail to address the problem of serfdom. And because they fail to address the problem of serfdom, the changes they make are largely surface level. And Russia remains an incredibly unequal society in which the top 5% of landed aristocrats own the bottom 90% of the society. Now, this turns out to be completely unsustainable. And in the 19th century, Russia realizes that they have to make real changes to their society if they want to continue competing with Western Europe. And the first thing that brings about a call for real change was Russia's war with France during the Napoleonic era. When Napoleon invaded Russia in 1812, he brought with him the ideas of the French Revolution. And these ideas began to spread in Russia, in every Russian town that he took. And later, when Russia fought back and eventually invaded France, Russian soldiers and Russian officers learned about the ideas of the French Revolution. So ideas of limited government, ideas of universal law codes that apply to everybody equally, and they saw the wealth and the advancement of French society. So after the war was over, many of the Russian officers who had been to Paris and who had read the works of Locke and Montesquieu and Voltaire began to call for real change. They wanted a constitution. They wanted a legal reform. They wanted guarantees of certain human rights, and they mounted a protest. So a very large segment of the Russian officer corps in the new capital city of St. Petersburg, named after Peter the Great, staged a protest outside the Tsar's palace, calling for a constitution, calling for basically for Russia to become more like France and more like England. And the Tsar responded to this by bringing in troops from outside and shooting his own officers. This was known as the Decemberist Revolt, which happened in 1825. And the Tsar, during this time period, showed that he was completely unwilling to reform, and that anybody who called for change risked being shot or arrested. But this doesn't mean that interest in reform went away. In fact, it went underground, and many people continued to work for and to build grassroots movements calling for change and reform. So the first motive for modernization was that the ideas of the French Revolution began to spread in Russia after Napoleon's invasion. But the real wake-up call, the real thing that made modernization inevitable, was war with England and France. And this happened in 1853 in the Crimean War. The Crimean War starts for a bunch of complex reasons that I don't really want to go into, but basically it has to do with Russia trying to take over parts of the Mediterranean. The Ottoman Empire is pretty weak. Russia's still pretty strong, relatively. And so Russia starts trying to take over land in the Ottoman Empire so that way they can control parts of the Mediterranean Sea. England does not want this. England really, really wants to control the Mediterranean. That way they can trade with India, because you can sail up the Mediterranean and then cross here into the Red Sea, and then from the Red Sea it's a pretty short sail to India. So this is absolutely crucial for British trade. So when Russia starts pushing Turkey around, Britain and France tell Russia that they better back down, and Russia doesn't, because that's not what Russia does. And so Britain and France declare war on Russia. And you'd think that this would probably be a pretty close struggle because Russia's huge and Britain and France are pretty far away from where the fighting's happening. But it's not. Britain and France are industrialized at this point. They have steamships, they have telegraphs, they have advanced rifles and advanced artillery, and they're just very good at deploying huge amounts of men and materials. So they load a bunch of stuff up on steamships, sail it up into Russia, land on the Crimean Peninsula right here, and proceed to beat up on Russia. In fact, Britain and France get to the Crimean Peninsula before the main Russian army, because the main Russian army is still relying on horses and wagons, whereas Britain and France can use railroads and steamships to deploy their guys. So, Britain and France, in short, completely own Russia in the Crimean War. And this is a huge wake-up call to Russia. Russia realizes that if they want to remain a military power in the modern world, they have to industrialize. And if you want to industrialize, you have to modernize your society. You have to have the free movement of laborers, you have to have the protection of property, and you have to have markets in which people can buy and sell shares in companies and stuff like that. So this is a huge wake-up call, and this leads the Tsar of Russia, Alexander II, to make the first real major reforms to Russian society. So let's talk about Alexander II. Alexander II, in 1866, takes the monumental step of freeing all of the serfs. 90% of the Russian population, which has been owned for hundreds of years by the landowning aristocrats, are legally freed and given rights as individual people. This is a huge deal. This, of course, is very bad for the aristocrats, and we'll talk about the implications for that. But by freeing the serfs, Alexander is hoping that simultaneously the serfs will work harder because now they're independent people who can keep their own products that they grow. And he's also hoping that some of the serfs will choose to move into cities and then become urban industrial workers. So by freeing the serfs, he's hoping to make agriculture more productive and to free up laborers to work in factories. he also, on top of that, begins to introduce very, very limited amounts of democracy. And he does this by allowing for elections among landowners in local government. These local government institutions are known as the Zemstvos, and they decide on pretty minor stuff like road maintenance, schools, and hospitals in their regions. But this is basically like baby democracy. It's giving the elite members of Russian society practice in running their own affairs. And last of all, Alexander II does institute a uniform legal code in which all people, regardless of whether or not they're serfs or landowners, have the same rules that apply to them. And so these are three major steps towards modernization. You've got the free movement of labor, you've got some local representation, and you've got a uniform civil or legal code that outlines certain rights and certain punishments. This is only step one, however, and Alexander's reforms are of limited effectiveness for various reasons that we'll talk about. But the main problem is that the serfs don't actually move off of the land. The serfs, by and large, stay in their villages even after they become free. And this happens for a number of reasons. One, there aren't really that many good jobs in the cities. And until there are good jobs, there's no reason for the serfs to leave. And so, in order to make that happen, Russia decides to borrow a whole lot of money from other countries. Specifically, they begin borrowing money from France. Now, why is France willing to give a whole lot of money to Russia? Well, it's complicated, but basically because France hates Germany. And France is willing to give money to Russia so that Russia can industrialize. That way, Russia can then threaten Germany from the east. Don't worry about all that. But so anyway, France begins giving Russia huge loans that will allow Russia to begin building factories. So basically, France is supplying the capital that Russia needs to get the whole industrialization process started. So Russia then starts building steel plants and coal mines and railroads in its major cities. And then this creates demand for jobs. So that way the serfs have somewhere to go. And so at this point, millions of serfs begin moving into these big cities to take up jobs in these massive steel plants and coal mines and stuff like that. At the same time, Nicholas II also begins the process of privatizing Russian land. Up until this point, land was owned collectively by the village, by communal villages, which meant that if you decided to leave, you couldn't sell your land and cash it in and make money off of it. You just had to go and you got kicked out of your village. But so by breaking up the villages into private plots of land, this is hopefully going to encourage people who don't like farming to sell their land and move to the cities, and allow people who are good at farming to buy up lots of land and do it the right way. So anyway, all of this is designed to get as many people as possible to move out of the countryside and into the cities. And this actually is quite effective. However, it's happening in 1910, and this is only 4 years before World War I. A lot of historians think that if Nicholas II had issued these reforms earlier, or maybe if Alexander II had issued similar reforms, Russia might have successfully industrialized and become a huge capitalist industrial power. Instead, however, these reforms are going to happen quite late, and it's ultimately going to result in a massive revolution in which angry workers take over the Russian government and institute a communist state. We'll talk about that in a couple of weeks, though. Now, one issue that's going on here is that there are massive groups within Russia who do not support modernization. Modernization is good for the state, but it's not really necessarily good for a lot of the people living in Russia at the time, because these transformations are going to have serious negative effects on a lot of the people living there. The most important group that opposes modernization are the old-fashioned aristocratic elites. For them, Russia is basically a paradise. They own all the land and most of the people and basically get to just sit around and be super rich and build sweet palaces and hang out. So for example, this is the Stroganov Palace in St. Petersburg. It's this huge, massive palace that almost looks like a wedding cake right on the canal in St. Petersburg. These guys didn't really have to do anything. They owned lands that were like the size of some small countries. And this is one of the heads of the Stroganov family. They even had a dish named after them, a beef stroganoff. And really, they actually, that's where that comes from. And so these guys who have massive land holdings and like hundreds of thousands of peasants who work for them do not want the serfs to be freed. And one reason that the serfs are freed so late is because some of the most powerful and wealthy people in Russian society are working against it. So that's one reason that Russian reforms happen so slowly, and why it ultimately, when Russia does reform, it's too little too late. However, another interesting problem is that actually a lot of peasants are also opposed to modernization. And you might think that the peasants or the serfs would support modernization, because who wants to live in poverty and be owned by rich people far away? But many of the peasants were very skeptical of the government. They've basically been screwed over by the government for all of history. So when the government comes in and starts offering reform and changes, many of the peasants do not trust them. And they would rather just keep things the way they are because at least they know how that works. And they're very distrustful of ideas of change or progress. For them, if anything changes, it's usually for the worse. And so a lot of peasants refuse to adopt new tools. A lot of peasants refuse to move to the countryside and keep doing things the old-fashioned way, even though they're being encouraged to adopt new, more productive methods of agriculture and stuff like that. So you basically have 95% of the population in Russia opposed to change. So that's not going to be super easy. And last of all, one other force that's making change difficult for Russia is there are some people who are demanding super rapid change right away. And these people are political radicals. Many of these guys live in cities and are university-educated young men and women who believe that Russia is evil and needs to be destroyed and rebuilt from the bottom up. And if you think about Russia as being basically a slave society in which 90% of the population lives in poverty, their claim that Russia is evil actually is maybe a pretty reasonable claim. But so they don't want reform. They don't want Russia to get better. They want to destroy the Russian state and rebuild something better afterwards. Two of the biggest groups, there are a whole bunch of different groups, but there are two groups within Russia who I think are worth knowing about. One, who I find super interesting, are called the nihilists. And the nihilists believe that Russian society is so bad that we should just destroy it completely, and that no matter what comes afterwards, it will be better than what Russia is. So they don't actually have a positive plan for what comes next. They just want to overthrow the Russian government and bring about essentially the purge. They want chaos, they want revolution, they want anarchy, they want foreign invasion. Just anything but what exists right now. And one of their main strategies is just terrorism. They just bomb important buildings, they assassinate important leaders, and one person they assassinate, most importantly, is Tsar Alexander II, the guy who freed the serfs. They plant a bomb under his carriage. The first one goes off and doesn't kill him, but he gets out of the carriage to help his wounded footmen, and the second one blows him up. And so the main reformer in Russian history is killed by people who essentially want reform, which is kind of ironic. The other really important group that you need to know about are the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks are a Marxist revolutionary group who want to overthrow the Tsarist government, and they want the workers who live in the cities to take over Russia and rule in the name of international communism. This is kind of weird because almost nobody in Russia is an industrial worker at this point. But that doesn't stop the Bolsheviks from arming workers in major cities and planning for the takeover of the Russian government, which they will eventually do successfully in 1917. Here's a picture of Alexander II getting blown up. All right. So anyway, that is kind of the broad overview of Russian modernization. Ultimately, these reforms happened too little too late, And by the time Russia enters World War I, they are still largely an unindustrialized pre-modern society with an absolutist government and very limited industrial production. So what was successful and what was unsuccessful in Russian modernization? So some important things that I think we should count as successes is they do free the serfs. You also do see limited industry and modernization starting around 1900. So it's possible that if Russia had avoided World War I and had given itself more time to industrialize, you might have seen more success. You also do see limited local self-government. And last of all, you do get a modern, uniform legal code. That's actually based on the Napoleonic Code that Napoleon wrote during the French Revolution. So on the other hand, there are some serious limitations to what Russia accomplishes. So first of all, most serfs stay on their villages. So even though they're free, they remain in these tiny villages and keep doing old school, unproductive agriculture. Second, industry starts too little too late. They are basically starting their industrial revolution 100 years after Britain did. And so while they are growing very quickly, they don't have time to catch up before World War I hits. Another failure is that they remain ultimately an absolutist state. So even though they do have a uniform legal code and some local self-government, at any point the government could just change its mind and rewrite the legal code. So this leads to limited stability and lack of trust in government. Because even though they do have a legal code, that legal code is by no means permanent. It could change at any point. So that's all I've got for you guys today. One last thing I would like for you to think about, and there's a section for this on your guided notes, is I would like for you to think about how this compares to other societies that we've looked at. So one society that's really interesting to compare Russia to is Japan, because like Russia, Japan starts out as a pre-modern feudal state, and they attempt to transition into a modern industrial power. However, Japan is successful. So one thing that's worth thinking about, and I think you should go back in your notes and look at this, is what does Japan do right when it comes to modernization, and what does Russia do wrong? What are the differences there that explain Japanese success and Russian failure? Second, you could also think about, you could also compare Russia to what we were looking at with India and the Great Mutiny. Specifically, you could think about military resistance to Western imperialism, and think about the Indian Mutiny compared to like the Crimean War, for example. You could also potentially connect Russia to the Zulu and look at Zulu resistance to the British versus Russian resistance to the British. And then the last society we're going to look at when it comes to resisting European imperialism is we're going to be looking at China and the Qing dynasty. And we'll be looking at that when we come back to school on Monday. So you've got that to look forward to. All right, guys. But so that's all I've got for you today. Feel free to chat me or email me if you have any specific questions. And again, make sure that you complete the guided notes and put them into your folder. That way I can mark you present for today's asynchronous class. All right, guys. Thank you very much. And I look forward to seeing some of you in person next week.